Okay, I'm seeing the sign. This webinar is being live streamed. So does it
I
mean
will,
good to go?
I will start the webinar and the attendees will come in right now.
Okay. Okay. So we're gonna get going. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this first panel in the webinar series Epistemologies of the South. My name is Özge Savaş. I am a critical social psychologist and an assistant professor at the College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts, United States. I am also the co-chair of Species Internationalization Committee, which is organizing this webinar series with the goal of decentering Euro-American ways of knowing while bringing knowledges and knowledge-making practices that often remain in the peripheries to the spotlight. We believe in the critical importance of this goal, especially now, given the poly crisis that we're in is a global crisis, and the solutions to our problems require collective sense making and figuring out the ways in which our communities in different parts of the world are interdependent. Today's panel is the first in this series, and we will be bringing voices from various regions and countries of the world to this series within the next year. This panel is co-hosted by Oscar Fopsi in Colombia, and we will hear more about Oscar Fopsi later from the panelists. Today, we have four wonderful panelists who will be talking about the intersections of legal action and psychology in Colombia. My colleague Felipe Ramirez, who is a member of the Internationalization Committee and is a PhD student at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, will introduce our speakers. Before handing it over to Felipe, I would like to express my gratitude to him, who co-organized this panel with me and actually did all the work. I also would like to thank Sam Abbott, who is Species Director of Policy and Communications, who has helped us get this off the ground and is providing technical support today. After the introduction of our panelists, we will hear briefly about Oscar Fopsi and the Ethnic Discrimination Project. Then we will have each of our panelists speak for about 20 minutes, and we will have a Q&A at the end for 15 minutes. So we will be asking you to put your questions in the chat. You can also put your questions in as we go, but we will be turning to them at the end. And we hope we will have enough time to answer all the questions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Felipe, who will introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much. I am so glad to be presenting a wonderful team who is led by José Ignacio Ruiz Perez. He is an associate professor at Universidad Nacional de Colombia. He coordinates the laboratory in law in psychology. His research interested in social attitudes, antisocial behavior, prison traffic psychology, and pathological gambling. Later, Juan Camilo Carvajal Bulles is going to speak. He's a psychologist and especially in legal psychology, master in legal forensic and criminologic psychopathology. He also has a master in psychology and a PhD in psychology. He is an advisor, consultant, and private forensic expert. He coordinates the specialization at the Legal and Criminal Psychology Laboratory of Universidad Católica de Colombia, and he's the coordinator of the legal psychology of ASCOFAPSI. Later is going to speak Leonardo Rafael Neslava. He is a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies. He has a master in interdisciplinary social research, and he's also a professor in the department in psychology at Corporación Universitaria Iberoamericana in Bogotá. He has worked for NGOs such as Dr. Vera Boulders, Action Against Hunger, and Ayuda en Acción. He's the co-founder of the NGO Si País in Colombia. He is the recipient of a number of scholarships, and he interest of research is critical and emancipatory peace building, peace psychology, resistance, and any conflict. And later is going to speak Diego Alejandro Velandia Vanegas. He is a PhD student in the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. He's also a psychologist from this university. He is a clinic and forensic psychology based in Bogota, a lecturer in psychometry and research methodologies. Thank you so much, and we hope you have a wonderful webinar. our first presentation is going to be right now Juan Camilo, who is going to speak about the Ascofalsic psychology London.
Okay, thank you, Felipe, for your presentation. As you mentioned, my name is Juan Camilo Carvajal. At the moment, I am the coordinator of the group on psychology and law from ASCOFAPSI. ASCOFAPSI is one of the most important associations of psychology in Colombia. This association offers different supports in academic and scientific purposes for different faculties of psychology in Colombia about research, publications, and academic events. And SCOFAPSI has different groups of research or different groups of thematic or topics areas in psychology. For example, psychology and law, but not, the unique of this. Then let me share something about the webpage of ASCOFAPSI. If you put ASCOFAPSI on Google, you can see this webpage, ASCOFAPSI. Wait a minute, while it is loading. It is so slow today. I don't know why. I think I should. Okay. If you see here about us, you can see the node or group in psychology, and there are different groups, and you can check the information about the researchers, about the topics, about the contacts. For example, neuroscience, psychology uh, for environmental psychology, psychological basic processes, development psychology, and of course, psychology and law. If you put on this microsite, microwave page in ASCOFAPSI, you can see the researchers, you can see the purposes, you can see about the academic production or publishings of different members of this group. For example, Jose Ignacio, who is with us in this moment, and another researcher that who are part of this association, no, in this group. And my invitation is to explore ASCOFAPSI webpage and select the group or research that you are interested on, and you can contact or you can search about the investigation research here in Colombia, and that's all for the moment. I don't want to use so minutes for this, but the important thing here is SCOFAPSI is a association so important and offers different support to faculties of psychology in Colombia. Thank you, Felipe.
Thank you so much, Juan Camilo. Right now, the following panelist is going to be Jose Ignacio Ruiz, who is going to present any project that he already played in Colombia, and he's going to speak later as at the conference.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to have a presentation of our project. This project, the general project, is a research on racial discrimination in Colombian criminal justice system. To our knowledge, this is the first study in Colombia at least with the mixed method and multi-level approach that we are going to present. This project was funded by the Colombian section of the National Center for State Courts in 2023. Next, please. Ethnic population in Colombia are minorities, comprising between the 10 to 11% of the total population. However, indigenous and Afro-Colombian descendant groups are the majority or close to 50% of the population in several regions of the country. We can see in this slide the proportion of indigenous communities in regions of Colombia and the black populations in the western Pacific regions of Colombia. For indigenous peoples, we have in Colombia 50, at least 50 indigenous languages spoken between 1,000 or 50,000 speakers. Part of the indigenous population lives in cities, often due to reasons like work, education, or escaping armed violence in rural areas. However, another part lives in small communities or villages known in Spanish language as resguardos. As of 2024, the world 846 resguardos in Colombia. Next, please. In Colombia, there are two criminal justice systems, the ordinary system and the indigenous justice system. Uh, this system for indigenous people serve to judicialization minor crimes, for instance, robbery. And the ordinary criminal justice system is for all for serious crimes for all nationals in Colombia, indigenous, black people, or white people. This project we have conducted in 2023 is about ordinary criminal justice system for indigenous or black communities. Next, please. We think the research we have conducted is a mindset methodology and multi-level approach. Because we have used several research techniques. We can see in this slide the levels of criminal justice system, and we have covered we, with the project police, prosecution, and judges, and prisons. We staff, lawyers, and also inmates with interviews. But during these interviews, we have we used questionnaires, uh, mm, receipts with implicit attitudes, analysis of databases, institutional databases from police, prosecution, and prison system. Next, please. The main concept of this research is there if is there any positive or negative discrimination in the implementation or operation of the criminal justice system based on ethnic this discrimination based on ethnic background, indigenous or Afro-descendant groups. Discrimination for this project can be subtle, explicit, or structural, eh, according several authors. But this is the general view of the project. Thank you very much.
So right now we are going to present like the Professor Jose Ignacio is going to present the main results of the project that he had started. We are going to present again.
Okay. So we can present the other presentation. Okay, thank you very much. This is a part of this presentation is it's a part of the general project only with data of police. Sorry, policy with in Spanish version with con la tilde. I'm sorry. Bueno, there are in Colombia very scarce research with police officers samples. The, the theme is stress, post-traumatic stress, but they are not, they aren't research researchers about work attitudes, or in this case, uh, resist attitudes. In sorry. Research on negative prejudice, attitudes, or stereotypes in the crime justice system is frequent in USA and other developed countries. But however, this research is very scarce in Colombia. But we can find several studies and data of racial discrimination in our country. So news and complaints show aggressions against Black people, insults during police stops, and other ways of discrimination against indigenous or Black people. So this research was very necessary relative our context, national context. Next, please. So we will present studies in this presentation. One about explicit attitudes, racist attitudes, and the second about implicit attitudes. For the first study, we can see here the same plot is not aleatory. They are police officers. The majority are male, and the socioeconomic status is low, with the majority is 71% is low class. For this research, we have developed an scale with the final version has 12 items. These items came from several another scales in literature. The internal reliability is high, and we have conducted factorial analysis and cluster analysis for in order to identify the groups of racist attitudes in the sample. Next, please. Here we can see three samples of items of the scale. We have had an adaptation of these items for the Colombian context. Next, please. We have conducted an exploratory factor analysis with this scale. We have obtained 4 factors, and secondly, we have calculated cluster groups according factor scores. Like this, we found 4 clusters of individuals related with attitudes. The first cluster we name ambivalent racism. This group shows high scores in subtle racism and positive attitudes to opportunities for all ethnic groups. The second cluster we name the unwilling to help any groups, with low scores in manifest racist attitudes, but high mean and willing to help ethnic groups. The third uh, cluster, we name it explicit regimes and dominance, showing high scores in negative traits of any groups, for instance, lazy people, Black or indigenous population are lazy people. And secondly, high scores in social dominance. For instance, societies should be hierarchical. Finally, the the fourth cluster we name egalitarians. These participants believe all social groups have human rights with low scores in explicit and subtle racism, and with high scores relating to feeling upset about thinking in a racist way. Uh, the next, please. Thank you very much. The methodology of the second study is about implicit attitudes. The sample is non-randomized with 208 police officers. Majority are male and low class. We have used Pavlovia platform to to develop the experiment. Felipe is a fundamental part of this study. Next, please. So, methodology is case-based in implicit attitudes. Each participant answered two cases. Each case is to duplicate, changing the character black versus white or indigenous versus gypsy. In this slide, you can see the two versions. On the other hand, we have four dependent variables. In the case, community is calling police, and a police officer is in the scenario, and participant must to answer three questions. Will the police officer conduct a deeper investigation with the case? Does a police officer believe that character is innocent or guilty? This police officer will mediate between neighbors and the delinquent. And for all these questions, we have measured the reaction times. The next slide, please. As results, in this slide we can see several interesting results. The reaction relating to reaction times, first times were found for innocent, for in the robbery and family violence cases. The first times were more faster, were faster if a character is black. Relating to sex crime, uh, faster times were founded for in-depth investigation versus innocent assignation. And for the social protest, participation in social protest, fastest times were for innocent versus investigation, and the fastest times were for indigenous versus gypsy. In the next results concerning the three questions, the investigation, mediation, or innocent or guilty, we found for a robbery high probability to conduct the investigation if a character is black versus white. For family violence, the result is opposite, the lower probability to conduct investigation if character of the case is black. For sex crime, lower probability if gypsy versus indigenous. And mediation is also with a lower probability when the character is was gypsy. From the participation in social protests, higher probability is for a gypsy character versus indigenous. About discussion and conclusions, we found about this, explicit attitudes, a high internal reliability of the scale. 53 police officers showed higher racist attitudes, but means are near of 3 from 1 to 5. So racist attitudes are not as strong. Along work life, policers receive formal education and instructions of human rights. Can this education and instruction on human rights counteract racist attitudes? It's a question to explore in other in future studies. About implicit attitudes, we found black people receives positive discrimination when investigating family violence, but negative discrimination for robbery. Concerning indigenous versus gypsy characters, negative discrimination when investigating crime, sex for indigenous character, but positive discrimination for participation in social protest. Next, please. Yes, thank you very much. You have my email here for additional information about these research.
Thank you so much to Professor José Ignacio. Right now is going to present Professor Juan Camilo Carvajal.
Okay, Felipe. Wait a minute, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that I have been studying around 10, 15 years ago. It is about deception detection. This presentation is about two perspectives in this topic: verbal behavior analysis and psychophysiological responses analysis, in order to detect some indicators to deception behavior. This is the agenda for this presentation. In the first part, introduction about some concepts, about some context, methodology, results, and finally conclusions. Uh, uh, for starting, it is important to say that deception is a social behavior. It means that the deception is part of the life, it's part of the human beings. There are no human beings that not emit deception behavior, because it is a important part of the social interactions. It means if you don't have deception skill, it is so difficult. You would be a complication when you interact with others, because you need to anticipate different thing of the others, and you need to adapt your behavior, and in this moment you need to deceive in for social interaction in a good way, no. uh, Another part is the it is usually when you deceive, your behavior and your psychophysiological response is different, and literature scientific literature has reported that it is normal changes of emotions on other psychological processes, like social processes or like cognitive processes, because when you deceive, you need to, for example, uh, more effort, or more effort of cognitive processes, in order to anticipate, in order to control your behavior, and finally to be successful to deceive. No. Um, uh, Fortunately, when you deceive, you don't receive the feedback about your behavior. It means that you or people think they are so uh, how to say that, uh, um, people people think that they are so uh, skillful to deceive, but it's not the real, because whatever what happened, some indicators and in verbal and non-verbal behavior, and even in psychophysiological responses could appear. Obviously, when you need to analyze deception behavior in legal context, you need to know different strategies and scientific methodologies in order to detect this behavior. Because if you don't have this methodology, or you don't apply these methodologies, the percent of detection in legal context is very low. Some researchers have reported that it doesn't matter if you are psychologists, police officers, judges, or something like that. If you don't use scientific methodologies, the percent of discrimination of deception is around 50%. And this is a very concerned topic, because many legal decision, it is like an it is a high probability to get uh, uh, see, I have probability to don't discriminate the correct behavior. I mean, it means honest and dishonest behavior could be there, but it is not probably to detect it. What are the some characteristic of deception behavior? The fear is the intention, no? When you deceive, you have the intention to produce false information, and your objective is manipulate others. You know that the information that you are transmitting in that moment, it is false, no? And the intention is transmit this kind of information. People is conscious about it, no? The another characteristic of deception is, as I mentioned before, deception is a social behavior. It is important to interact. No, for example, if you see a friend with a new jacket and you think the color of the jacket is not good for you, and you see the emotion in your friend, and you can see, no, this jacket is so perfect, it's awesome, where can I find this jacket for me? But you see the emotion in another, and you could think another thing, but you anticipate the reaction of your friend, and you omit information, no? And you offer different information because of the social interaction, because of the maybe the bad reaction if you are honest in all moment, no? And a deception behavior implies different modalities like a simulation, dissimulation, deny information. And when you are talking of deception, the deception is the big category. And there are different modalities like lie, for example, lie or lies. This is a kind of deception behavior. It is only when you are talking for information. This is you are lying when you produce false information through verbal behavior. The another kind of, of deception, maybe you are talking about non-verbal or psychophysiological responses. Psychophysiological responses. That is another thing that you need to consider. In deception detection, in psychology of testimony, traditionally there are three perspectives to analyze. The first is nonverbal behavior, the second verbal behavior, and the third psychophysiological responses. In this talking, I'm going to talk about some things about the second and the third perspective of deception detection. What about verbal behavior analysis? To start, the words or the language is so important to analyze, because through the language you can detect different psychological processes like emotions, thoughts, social processes, and different things. No, and this is not novel. No, a lot of centuries ago, Aristotle, for example, he say, uh, talk me, uh, depending of you talk, no, you can, I can see your thoughts, your feelings, no. The importance of the analyze the words, because the words transmit information or psychological information in a spontaneous and natural way, no. In psychology and law, traditionally the content analysis, it is the most strategy or most methodology that we use in psychology of testimony. And this methodology, it is focused on the messages and meanings, And the important thing here is the content of the language is manipulated. No, you can control the content. You can control what I need to say, what information it is better to avoid. No, and this is a real challenge to analyze deception in this methodology or with this methodology. But there is another possibility that is the linguistic style. The linguistic style is not related to the meaning of the word. It is like it is related to the how I use the word. Now, for example, how I use the pronouns, articles, preposition, and other basic words for the language. And this kind of methodology is associated with automatic processes, and it's so difficult to alterate or to change the way that you speak or you write, because with the pass of the time the way to use the words, it is like a fingerprint, no, and it is so difficult, and it is and different researchers consider that the use of the word transmit more psychological information than the content. Because of the content, it is very easy to manipulate. Here I'm going to talk about one research that we made 2 years or 1 year ago. Was a literature review. We analyzed 40 empirical studies, and what do we find, or what did we find here? The language of the studies, obviously, the greater of the researchers, the investigations here, it was made with English in English language, 85%. It means the outcomes or the evidence to indicators of linguistic style in order to detect deception is in English language, and only 10% in Spanish. And this is a possibility to improve and increase this kind of investigation here in our context. And another thing that I consider this is so important to the psychology of testimony is uh, the most of the researchers here, it is they are focused on the suspects, and suspects they are not the only kind of witnesses that we need to analyze in a judge, no, in a legal context, because there are victims, spectator, reference witnesses, and the psychological processes in this kind of witnesses so different, and it's necessary to analyze this particular psychological process different in order to detect properly. About the linguistic style or variable or linguistic variable associated to deception, the 55% mention the use of pronoun. It means that the way that you use the pronouns, it could differentiate honest and dishonest sentences. For example, some researchers have reported the pronoun I. It is so common when you are deceived, because this is a way that you focus on yourself and you not consider the other people. And other researchers have reported the contrary. And the real thing here is the pronoun transmit a social information, and it is important to analyze in order to comprehend the deception detection. Uh, One another thing, the emotion. It is not a, how to say that. It is not the in all dishonest statement you it appears a negative emotion. No, it's possible that the statement is characteristic with positive emotion, but the expressed emotion, higher emotion, it could be a cue or indicator of deception in some moments. And when we use this kind of methodology, linguistic style, the literature scientific literature research showed that it's possible to discriminate around 74% in honest statement and 71, 72% in dishonest statement. And it's a good change to use in real context. And obviously, it is necessary uh, to do more research and research with different particularities in order to comprehend this complex behavior like deception. No? Finally, the scientific literature say that it is possible to find different linguistic styles associated with deception, and it's necessary to consider different characteristics of the witnesses of the events in order to fit the strategies to the self-detection, and it is necessary to combine, for example, linguistic style with content analysis, because the content analysis could offer more richness interpretation about the language. No, by another way, what about the psychophysiological responses? There are different instruments than that they have been used for detecting deception. One of these is polygraph. As you probably know, the polygraph is not allowed to use in real forensic context, but there are some researchers for deception detection, and they are found different characteristics for a differentiate deception. For example, galvanic skin activity is higher when you deceive and when you are honest. And another thing is some characteristic or some psychophysiological responses are different depending of the sex, because in men the respiration possibly is more characteristic when people deceive, men deceive, and in women, skin electrical activity maybe could be the first characteristic, at least of this with polygraph. No, with you about the percent of discrimination when in the respiratory indicator or measures, almost 80% were discriminated properly in this investigation. That is a good news here. And when you combine galvanic skin, for example, a finger pulse measurement, the detection of deception is around the 92%. That is a high percent of discrimination of this behavior. And obviously, the greater of these researchers have been in simulated context, and obviously the motivation and other things so different in real context. For example, in the investigation, you are uncovered, you won't receive the bonus, the money, but in the real forensic context, if you are uncovered, you will go to the prison. No, and this this difference is important to consider to try to generalize these outcomes. Another instrument important here, the thermal camera, it is not a common instrument to detect deception, but here I brought one study that I consider is so interesting, because it was made in at the airport in real context, and they found the people when deceived, the temperature of the face increased around 0.5 degrees centigrades. And when people are honest, the 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 thermal or the temperature of the face is less, no? And it is so curious. It is a good way to do this kind of research, combine different instruments or different perspective, even this thermal camera. Another instrument have been used in deception detection is functional magnetic resonance. And here, two kind of areas of the brain have been associated with deception, like frontal and temporoparietal areas. These frontal areas, they are associated with the with activities which are so difficult, which imply concentration, cognitive resources so high to do this activity. And these kind of areas, temporal they have been associated with social behavior. If this part of behavior uh, function properly and the activity is higher, it is more probably that you detect and you produce deception properly. Another instrument is eye tracker. Eye tracker is an instrument that register and give information about your visual behavior. For example, number of fixation, time of fixations, diameter of your pupil. And for example, when you deceive, the saccadic movements are higher in comparison when you are talking about honest information, no? Because saccadic movement is characteristic from the activities, different hard activities, no? When you do simple or easy activities, the movement the movement saccadic maybe will be so less. And about the discrimination with this instrument, the scientific literature have found around 78% to discriminate dishonesty statement and 84% in honesty statement. That is so curious when you put your eyes in the percent of discrimination, and it doesn't matter this verbal or non-verbal or psychophysiological responses. The 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 higher percent of discrimination, it is about the honesty statements. And maybe some researchers have mentioned that maybe the correct name of these strategies is not deception detection, but it is about honesty deception, because this strategy is more accurately to deceive honesty in comparison with deception. Electroencephalogram is another instrument. The outcomes are so similar that the resonance, magnetic resonance, in order to put the eye of the frontal and parietal and temporal areas. And it is important when you investigate psychophysiological responses. The fatigue effect is important because the fatigue could alterate the psychophysiological responses, and it is important to control the time of your investigation. So, to conclude this conference or this talk, there are some markers of psychophysiological responses in order to discriminate honest and dishonest statements, and the role of the frontal and temporoparietal areas is so important to the self-detection, and it shows that the difficult that implies the deception behavior and the social part of the deception because of the activation of this part of the brain. No, always is so important to combine strategies, comprehending that the deception behavior is so complex to detect, and it is so better to combine psychophysiological, verbal behavior, non-verbal behavior in order to detect properly, and in order to comprehend this complex behavior that is so necessary in real forensic context. Thank you so much. This is my information. If you want to write, as you need to add something, there are my information contact.
Thank you so much, Professor Juan Camilo. Right now is going to speak Professor Leonardo.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I would like to thanks to the Society for the Psychological Studies of Social Issues, also to the Nodo de Psicología Jurídica en ASCOFAPSI in Colombia for creating and organizing this important webinar. The title of my presentation is Historical, Cultural, and Political Analysis of Oppression and Resistance. The case of the Emberachami community in Colombia. The outline of this presentation is the following. First, I will describe the purpose of this study. Second, I will give some context of the Unified Chami Indigenous Reservation of the San Juan River. Third, I will mention the questions that guide my research. Later, I will highlight some general lines related to the implemented theoretical framework and methodology. And finally, I will mention the key findings of the research, and I will end up with some conclusions. Well, the primary purpose of this study was to explore the resistance tactics developed by the indigenous Emberachami to face power, oppressive, and exclusive social structures that derived from the Spanish conquest to the present day. Specifically, this analysis examined historical documents and scrutinized relevant social science studies. In addition, it includes the stories, voices, knowledge, and experiences of community members and leaders living in the indigenous reservation. Well, the historical and social context of this study began with the Emberachami in the conquest era. The indigenous people live in Panama, Ecuador, and Colombia. In Colombia, they are dispersed throughout the country due to different factors, including the Colombian conflict. The Embera group has 4 dialectical forms: Emberachami, Emberacatío, Emberadovida, and Siampede. As I already say, I focus only on Emberachami. In pre-Hispanic times, the Emberachami shared with other indigenous groups their territory located in the upper reaches of the San Juan River and at the Tatamar region, which is located at the Colombian Pacific region. All these groups were called by the Spaniards as Chocó or Chocoes. During the colonial period, the Spanish crown created the indigenous reservation to stop the total annihilation or destruction of the indigenous people, and to facilitate the acculturation process, and also to control the tax payments. When the Colombian independence occurred, the new Colombian state recognized the reservations, the indigenous reservations, as they were not part of any commercial transactions. However, the rules to administrate indigenous lands and to give rights to indigenous people was changing and was sometimes very ambiguous, forcing indigenous communities to pay taxes and to distribute their land to the general population and to be used in the national economy system. Now, after the Colombian independence, we can easily identify two general migration phenomena that affect indigenous communities. One occurred in the second half of the 19th century, and a second migration wave occurred at the beginning of the 20th century. In this period, the education system remained in the hands of the Catholic Church, and indigenous culture remained repressed. In general, the colonist migration into indigenous land turned indigenous people into day laborers. Now, I focus in the Chami Unified Indigenous Reservation of the San Juan River that was declared as a reservation in 1995. It is located in the department of Risaralda at the border with Chocó, the other department, the department of Chocó. The Indigenous Council is their social and political organization. This council is composed of 32 local governors who are selected by the people of each village that belong to that reservation. On the other hand, the Imberechami worldview is grounded on what they call the law of origin. This law, the law of origin, shapes their ancestral knowledge to understand and manage their territory. In this worldview, the Haibana is a central person within the community. The Haibana is a kind of traditional doctor who harmonizes the coexistence with nature, and this person is the guardian of all living beings in the community. Finally, we have to say that the land is the center of the community existent in these indigenous groups. Now, the guiding questions of this study were the following. First, what type of conflict did the Imberechemi indigenous people's ancestors face from the Spanish conquest of their lands to the present era? What resistance tactics have the Imberechemi indigenous groups implemented throughout their history? What are the characteristics elements of the resistance tactics implemented by the Imberechemi groups from the Spanish conquest to the present day? And four, what changes have the Imberechemi made to the resistance tactics and strategies throughout their history? In Colombia, researchers' interest has focused on the indigenous resistance experience, particularly on that from the Nasa indigenous people, who became a kind of non-violent paradigm. However, regarding the Imberechemi community, there is little literature associated with the resistance history, especially or specifically in relation to this particular reservation that articulate different changes, strategies, and methods. This community became a strategic case study because they are located in the same geographical area where their ancestors were living when the Spaniards arrived in their territory. In addition, nowadays, this territory is a strategic area from a military point of view, since it is an access route to the Pacific Ocean. And this has facilitated, for example, the entry of different armed groups into the regions since 1980s. Therefore, this community is essential to understand the interdependence between colonizer and colonized and the fluctuation of resistance methods throughout the history. Well, to understand how indigenous face conflict, I believe we should establish a dialogue among different theories and from an interdisciplinary framework. Therefore, I consider the following theoretical framework. I use Michel Desartaux's concept of tactic and strategy to understand the interrelation between oppressive structures and people agency to respond to oppression. Second, indigenous theory and rights of indigenous people. I explore the sumat causai, or in Spanish, el buen vivir, or good living in English, as an indigenous theory that comes from the Andean indigenous community. And critical Southern theory was used to emphasize on perspective originated from the periphery. Also, emancipatory theories, mainly those that come from post-colonial, post-liberal, and post-structural views, help me to elucidate indigenous agency. Finally, this study was also informed by what we call in peace and conflict studies, the local turn, to acknowledge local agency. And I address the concept also of imperialism and colonialism as a form of structural violence. The study methodology was designed doing or creating a dialogue between qualitative methodology and indigenous methodology. From a qualitative perspective, I use documentary research method to investigate historical and academic documents to explore embarrassment resistant process. I also gather information from secondary sources. And from the indigenous methodology, I use storytelling as a primary research method. I work with 18 participants from the community, and I try to ensure gender parity, and all the participants were adults. Well, briefly, I have three general analysis areas. First, the Spanish colonial strategy of domination and the Iberachami people resistance in the first part of the Spanish conquest. Second, the turn to colonialism, the mining activity and the advent of republicanism in Colombia. And third, the contemporary violence and resistance. Now, I will focus on some of the key findings from this study. First, I want to say that a key word that emerged in this research is otherness, which is a materialization of power structure rationality. And it is possible to access the notion of the other through the image or ideas reflected in people's narrative and stories. In this sense, the images found around the Iberachami indigenous people and their ancestors are part of the Colombian power structure strategy of domination during different periods, during different historical periods. It means that the Iberachami images or ideas are directly related to the ideology prevailing in different eras. For example, in the first part of the conquest period, the creation of towns and villages was a strategy to homogenize to homogenize and dominate indigenous people. However, this strategy faced resistance from indigenous groups, such as defending their territory with war, and when war didn't work, indigenous flee or escape, and sometimes they also use similar methods like we today call guerrilla warfare, for example. The Imberachami also create alliances with other indigenous groups and as well with the Spaniards. And they, indigenous Imberachami, they often betray those alliances in order to gain territories. The ideological context of the Spanish conquest was characterized mainly by the debate concerning the legal status of the indigenous population. The conquerors, who sought glory, power, and wealth, framed the indigenous people as a bellicose and barbaric. The barbarian image was used not only to justify war against the Emberachamese ancestors, but also to justify the need for creating new settlements to receive the Spanish crown's privilege and to reach the mining territories. That was central in the Pacific flank of the current Colombian conflict. Then the barbarian image was instrumental to achieve Spaniard goals. Later in the transition from the conquest period to the colonial system, I'm sorry, I need to drink a bit of water. Meaning the transition from the conquest period to the colonial system, the Spaniards' strategy was characterized by a more peaceful indoctrination. This strategy kept the creation of towns and villages, but their role changed to emphasize the territory used for an intensive acculturation process carried out mainly by Dominican missionaries' missions in that region specifically. Now, in this period, the barbarian image remained while it transitioned to a new image, the idea of peasants, for example. This idea of indigenous as a peasants was because Emberachami were used as settlers and miners, food providers. In addition, the colonial strategy facilitated the adoption of Spanish cultural characteristics like names and surnames, generating divisions within indigenous groups and weakening their resistance tactics through their individual and collective identity. There was also a new image, beast of burden. It is because indigenous individuals were utilized to transport heavy loads on their backs. Now, the indigenous people resistance in Chocó during the 17th century involved a combination of both violent and non-violent methods. For example, while indigenous people attacked with violent Catholic priests, other groups or other people refused supplying food to settlers and miners, and others complained to Spanish colonial authorities about Spaniards' mistreatment using the same legal structure created by the crown. So they implement different strategies to resist this structural powerful structure. In general, resistance tactics during the 18th century include fleeing Spanish settlements, forming alliances with other indigenous groups, and resisting the evangelization efforts of the Catholic priests. Now, during the emergency of the Colombian Republic, the implementation of new laws and the country's insertion into the global capitalist liberal system stimulate internal migration to colonize peripheral land. In this context, it is possible to find 4 specific images related regarding the Imberachami people. Indigenous as a minor, indigenous as a peasant or terrojeros, which was a feudal servile relationship with the landowner. Third, indigenous as a knockdown bush machines. And fourth, the indigenous as a proletarians. Regarding the resistance process in this period, Emberachami strategically deployed a legal discourse against the state and engaged with Colombian politicians to assert their rights and reclaim their ancestral lands. The discourse regarding ancestral lands was another tactic to resist a new power structure such as the Colombian state. Also, Emberachami inspired from the organization experience of the Indigenous Regional Council of Cauca to claim their ancestral land and strengthen their identity. Now, between 1980s and 2000s, the Emberachami territory was used as a corridor for armed illegal actors that connect the country to the Pacific Ocean. Both illegal and legal activities also inflict several damage to sacred sites and natural resources. Regarding the territory affection, here is an example of one of the participant stories. For example, Pedro told us, when the EPL guerrillas entered the territory, it was complicated. They scared people because you found them around, you found our armed groups with rifles. You found them in the park. The community was very afraid. Later on, when the FARC, another guerrilla groups, also arrived, it got even worse. There were fights, bombarding them, and they damaged many sacred sites in the territory. In addition, conflict also affects the Haibanas' life, as you can see in Bernardo's story. This is important because Haibanas bring harmony, balance between community and nature, and brings health and manage bad and good spirits. Well, the community also experienced homicides on their territory. Most of the murder cases were not declared before the justice institutions because families were afraid of receiving more threats from the perpetrators. Jorge's story narrates how one of the family's members was killed in the consequences for the family was catastrophic, experiencing double victimization, one from the armed group and one from the state institutions. In this scenario emerged a new indigenous image or idea, the indigenous as an infiltrator, and indigenous children and youth became target for recruitment by armed groups. The community particularly remember the kidnapping of children by armed groups at the Purembara school in the early 2000s. An example of this traumatic event is Miriam's story. Miriam reports how guerrilla groups declare that youth and children were their ownership. Therefore, the community struggled for the territory as well as for their children and youth. The resistance method against armed actors such as guerrilla groups and army in Colombia were their cultural identity, claiming the words, conversation, and the territorial rights. They also gathered the community to look for the kidnapped children into the mountains, and sometimes and something to highlight here is the women role, who lead the attempt to face armed group to rescue their children. Well, I think my time is run out, so I go into the some conclusions. Some of the conclusions regarding this study is that in order to understand conflict, there is a need of understanding power dynamics, discrimination, acculturation, oppression, and various forms of exclusion. There is a dialectical relationship between strategies of power control and tactics of resistance. We also can learn from oppressed voices, agency, and worldviews to build peace. Stereotypical images are consolidated from spheres of power and are instrumental tools. The embarrassment and their ancestral resistance span direct warfare and guerrilla tactics to non-violent methods. Indigenous people have adapted to their context and utilize both indigenous and settler strategies and tactics to resist oppressions. And finally, the Imberachami women leadership emerged from diversity. Well, thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Leonardo. Finally, is going to speak Diego Alejandro Velandia.
Good morning. Do you listen to me?
Yeah.
Thanks. And now, good morning or afternoon to everyone connect. I am deeply grateful for this invitation, that is who are joining us, and for the opportunity to share from the Colombian context some learnings, tensions, and especially to raise open question about how ethnic groups and I don't presentation. One second. Okay. From the Colombian context, some intention and especially to raise open question about how ethnic groups and identities are defined and recognized. I hope we can approach this from a critical and situated perspective, from my experience and from the participation in the project of identificando discriminación racial in the penal justice system with the teacher Jose Ignacio Luis, with exposed before of me. My name is Diego Velandia Vanegas. I am a legal psychologist, a university teacher, and I've had the opportunity to work with ethnic communities, judicial institutions, and social organizations on issues of access to the justice, different rights, and truth building in construction de la verdad. I am particularly interested in how legal language and institutional mechanisms can both recognize and make invisible collective identities. I speak today from my experience in the project on identifying racial discrimination, and from my work with victims and my approach to community-based process. Let me begin by inviting you to reflect on two questions. We define what an ethnic group and what are the consequences of that definition for rights, citizenship, and life itself. And this is a approx from this question. In Colombia, the identity is the personal concept and audiences of belong and identification with a group or role. And the ethnic groups is defined with a community by the existence of ancestors and a shared history. It is distinguished and recognized by shared traditions and ritual established social institutions and cultural traits, a language, cuisine, music, dance, spirituality, and other elements. The members of ethnic groups are aware of their belonging to it. They share a symbolic meaning and an historic depth. This is the definition of the DANE, el Departamento Administrativo Nacional de Estadísticas. Ahí we go to spoke with here after. In Colombia, the recognition of ethnic diversity is relatively recent. It was not until the 91 Constitution that the country was declared multi-ethnic and pluricultural. Since then, indigenous people, Afro-descendants community, Palenqueros, y Raizales and Rum people have been recognized and as a collective rights holders. We have a legal framework such as 169 Convention OET and the 17 Law of 93 for Afro-Colombian communities recognized and her rights, but I won't go into details for time reason. But I like to acknowledge the multiple legal instruments around prior consultation and territorial protection, which reflect the constant push by community for recognition. However, here lies the first issues. Identifying ethnic belongs has become an institutionalized matter. What defines the criteria? In many cases, these days, through census, registers, certification, and decrees, often this happen without acknowledging people's self-identification. For instance, in Colombia, the category of Afro-descendant, this category is more big. Afro-descendant is for differential focus. Afro-descendant, Afro-Colombiano, Afro-Colombian, Black or Negro, and Raizal y Palenquero. And in the census, in the last opportunity in 2018, that difference is in a group, in only a group, in just a group. But with this difference, the Afro-descendant is supposed to base it on self-recognition, especially Negro and Afro-Colombiano. But in practice, people must go through a hetero-recognition process to have that identity validate. Will I acknowledge the importance of hetero-recognition, especially when tied to affirmative action or presuppose or buying rights. But this is contradictory to emphasize self-identification. It is ultimate, not recognized as valid by institutions like the Ministerio del Interior and Interior Ministry. Another issues involve the DANE, I mentioned it before, DANE, National Administrative Department of Statistics, DANE for the acronym in Spanish, but that her initials Departamento Administrativo Nacional de Estadísticas. This is DANE is the entity responsible for national census data. Will it include an ethnical self-identification question like here? Do you recognize it like any ethnic group? Yes or not? Is often first to capture complex experience of mestizaje, multiples affiliations, and historic invisibilization of that group, that ethnic group, or that identification on that group for process of this ethnicization. When I speak of sorry, when I speak of this is ethnicization, I speak of the approach of the teacher Jimeno. She is a teacher emerito of a National University of Colombia, anthropologa, and he is work in this in this concept for the invisibilization, invisibilization of the identity. Many people have gone through forces to the ethnicization due to displace violence or urban migration, to displacement violence or for urban migration that erodes cultural reference, and yet they maintain a living collective identity. These forms of violence are not only physical, but symbolic. Language plays a key role in racial discrimination. I want to share an excerpt from the testimony of Juliet Micolta. Juliet Micolta is a Black Colombian woman. You'll find in the QR of the presentation and in the final of the presentation a link or to the Fury story. But in this case, I take the opportunity to read the excerpt. I was only 8 years old when I realized I was different. When you're a leader and you walk into a school full of boys, that's all you see, boys. To me, there was no difference until one day they yelled, anyone yelled, negra, and he is black, at me, and everyone laughed. I didn't resign anything, and that led me to the first visit to the psychologist. But then I realized I was different, and I didn't like it. Later, when I was in high school, I remember seventh grade. Well, all my classmates had strike high. To me, that high was beautiful. The teachers talked about Black ancestors and as slaves. I assumed I come from a slave, and that's what's it. They never told me about Garvey, Mandela, or King. They never taught me about Casilda and her stories of helping her brothers and sisters and taking them to the Palenque. They never mentioned Rosa Parks. They never mentioned that we all come from Africa. Thus, ethnic identification is not just a technical matter, it's a political and a symbolic stroke. From legal psychology, understood not only as a forensic field, but also a tool from a critical analysis of the legal system, we identified several barriers. First, the norm construct categories. The norms and the law build these categories. For instance, indigenous women victims of violence must often present certification of for ethnic belonging to access protection measures. Sometimes that can be absurd and re-victimizing. I recall a case I couldn't accompany further for this reason. The alleged perpetrator was a community leader, and the very same person responsible for issuing the technical certificate she needed. The case was dismissed for this reason. With the certification is no possible for the case. Second finding is the legal language tends to homogenize. It speaks of indigenous women as it al the same, without considering the origin, language, territory, or community. This lies in internal diversity. In Colombia, we meet with 87 different indigenous communities, and negro, afrocolombiano, parenqueros, raizales, and the Rum community is more most amplius of indigenous, like ever is the same culture, the same language, the same territory, and these consequences is the same treatment in the justice justice system in this case, but is the same treatment in all of the service, access, healthy, justice, education, uh, every. The third findings is the tension in applying differentiated justice. In Colombia has a special indigenous jurisdiction with found in parallel for the called ordinary jurisdiction. Yet the ordinary system still receives recognized ruling made by indigenous authorities, especially when their legal logics don't align with the Western forms. Recognition is even harder for a long time for the Afro and racial justice system, which is still struggle for institutional recognition, but is a very superficial recognition, and no can have a legal implication, real or objectives. Like enter into the jurisprudence of the ordinary system, the exercise of the Afro or racial form of justice in her group community. Un positive example comes from San Basilio del Palenque, territory recognized for the UNESCO like patrimonio cultural patrimony, where the Cimarron War, La Guardia Cimarrona, is well articulated with the ordinary justice system, offering a model of coordination and mutual respect with the ordinary system. But San Basilio del Palenque territory, like in Colombia, more of 24 a community of diaspora of parenqueros in Pacifico, includes in the another late of the country. Four, we see individual and collective impacts of institutional denial of ethnic identity, family ruptures, exclusion, and barriers to reparation in Colombia. a country in peace building. This is especially relevant for collective reparation process after the armed conflict with live in Colombia, living in Colombia. This is where an intersectional and a differential approach become essential. Not all indigenous, Afro, or Rom individuals experience is the same condition. Think of a trans-indigenous woman displaced to a capital city. How does her journey identity intersected with her ethnic belonging? How is she treated by her care service, by the system justice? Is recognized her difference, is recognized her condition, or is homogenized like white and citizen people, or is recognized a different enfoque? Institutional approach often fragment identities. The Ministry of Interior asks about your community. Healthcare asks about what is your insourced plan. In Colombia is the EPS, la entidad prestadora de salud. The justice system asks if you'll be filed compliant. There's no integrate perspective, and here no don't spoke in the project of racial discrimination in the justice system, in the penal justice system. We can watch the different institutions like Fiscalia, Policia don't don't share this information, and the people ethnical identity is diluida, is invisibilized for the institution. Another challenge is the internal plurality of people. Not all members of a group agree on how they should be recognized. Sometimes there are internal disputes over representation, generational tensions, or resource or for resource access, as I mentioned before, of the self-identification problem or self-identification argument for barrier this access. And a key challenge is knowledge production. Communities often have to scientifically prove their existence to be recognized, and the recognizing for positive laws. But who defines? But the question is, who defines what counts as valid proof? We do a census of what oral traditions. This is a more expensive, more expanded form of transmit the knowledge, and the oral traditions is invisibilized and is not recognizing for the institutionality. This is a clear expression of epistemic colonialism. Faced with this challenge, we propose working towards situated justice. It's a step for more step for a big step for a mountain for the recognize. I used to start listen to and respect the cultural, political, and epistemic frameworks of each people. It's not enough to have a law saying Colombia is pluriethnic, Colombia is multicultural. We need a deep institutional transformation and affirmative action that respects historical process of resistance and invisibility. This means training justice operators in different approaches, and only justice operator is for the focus of the project of discrimination racial, but all of the institution need this training and this formation in differential, intersectional, and ethnic approaches. Second, recognizing non-writing legal system. I mentioned before the oral tradition and her importance. Another praise is including historical memory and ancestral knowledge in judicial process. I mentioned in Colombia we have ordinary uses and uses traditional for the a leader no, of indigenous communities, but is separated, no is integrated in a system of justice or a system of contemplate or interpret the justice. Who is justice? Justice is focused in a occidental, sorry, and in a Western focus and no contempt a world view of the multiculturalidad and pluriethnicity with Colombia code. For last of this conclusion recommendation is the importance for ensuring real protection of territory, which is the foundation of collective identity. In the Colombian peace process, we recognize a river like subject to right, river Cauca like a river a subject to right. This is importance for the impact of the territory with the community's identity and the identity of the territory and vinculation and the problem of desplazamiento de nuestro use country. And from psychology and the social science, we must keep asking, who are we listening to? What knowledge counts? And what effects does the legal system have on subjectives and social bonds? As Catherine was reminded us, it is not just about including others into Western knowledge, but about transforming the structures of knowledge themselves. And I did like to close with a phrase that accompanied me for some times, a quote from a racial community leader from San Andres, with whom I had the chance to work. I know Luis. No basta con quien nos pregunten si somos o no somos parte de un grupo. Deben preguntarnos cómo queremos ser nombrados, cómo nos soñamos y cómo queremos vivir. In English is know and know to ask use whether or not we're part of a group. We must be asked what we want to be called, what we dream of, how we want to live. Social, this is the prominent social leader, Raizal of Archipelago de San Andrés y Providencia. Thank you. So thank you, you very much. In the last is my email for contact for question, and I expected for a question, commentary, or any more.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Diego. If you can stop sharing the screen.
No.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks to all of our panelists for this great compilation of presentations. It's very timely and relevant. And we're expecting to get questions from the audience. Please write your questions or comments in the Q&A box so we can convey them to the panelists. In the meantime, I was reflecting as I was listening on on the 5th anniversary of George Floyd's murder, and how in the US, for example, the conversation about the abolitionism and police reform have shifted in the last 5 years, when there was a push right after George Floyd's murder. In all these conversations were, brought up in the nationwide protests. Now we are seeing that the society is sort of like, these conversations have took a different turn, and we're not necessarily talking about the things that we were talking about 5 years ago. So I was questioning, as I was listening in Colombia, to all of our panelists, whoever wants to respond, what's your sense of sort of the temperature within the society and the public discourse in terms of thinking about evolution, thinking about restorative justice, thinking about police reform? What is holding space right now, and what's the dominant sort of conversation contemporarily in Colombia? Sort of like your sense of the debate. If anybody wants to sort of reflect on that as we are waiting for questions to trickle down.
Well, I guess I can think around that. Thank you for the question, Oski. I don't know. From the top of my head, I can think. Something that come to my head is, for example, that depend, of course, of the political ideology, which is at the government. There was a sweet change, something with the with the current Colombian government regarding the treatment to, for example, protests, social mobilizations. They are treated different. I'm not saying that I can't say that there is something like an improvement with social justice, but they are treated different. The social movement, you can see more respect probably compared with the former Colombian government. We had massive social mobilizations with the former government, and there was a lot of repression, and a lot of people died in that social mobilizations. And in the current government, that changed. When people go on the streets, and they can feel they can have a sense of they have the right to mobilize, and they have their those rights are kind of respect in that sense. So yeah, and I can mention something regarding your question related with that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very helpful. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and we will have to end the panel here. But thank you so much to all of our speakers and to our listeners for joining us today. And we hope to see you in the next panel for the epistemologies of the South.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye,
Much.
everybody.